Well, I think no, you're not right. It's much bigger nightmare in Britain than in China. The reason it's been difficult for me to get to China is not because of the situation in China. In China, I'd be the safest in the world. The problem is in Britain, not in China, because the situation on COVID in Britain is not in control. The situation, therefore, on the travel is not in control. And the nightmare is not the situation in China. The nightmare is the situation which is existing in Britain. And I know from the statistics, and I'm in contact with other people in the West all the time. So it's not a nightmare all over the world. I'm sorry, it's a nightmare outside of China. No, but the point, firstly, the number of people who are traveling around the world from China is a quite small proportion of Chinese population, whereas the number of people who would die is very, very high proportion of the population, in relatively high proportion of the population. So this is one of the worst pieces of propaganda that I've ever seen from the West. They literally want to kill millions of people in China in order to make profits. That's what the real situation, and people in China should understand that. This is just pure propaganda which is being carried on by the West. Let's just look at the figures. That's the most important thing, right? Okay. In China, there's been slightly over 5,000 deaths. In the United States, there's been over 1,080,000 to be precise. Okay, but we've got to remember that China has 4.3 times the population of the United States. So therefore, in order to see what would have been the impact of a US policy in China, you've got to multiply by 4.3. What that would mean, that is, if you'd had the same death rate in China in relation to population as in the United States, 4.7 million Chinese people would be dead. That is compared to 5,000, the latest data that I have is 5,226. Can you imagine 4.7 million Chinese would be dead? That is what the Chinese government has saved the Chinese people from. They have saved the Chinese people from a literal catastrophe. Let's look at the life expectancy in the United States. Life expectancy in the United States in the last 2 years has fallen by 2.7 years. Life expectancy in China is now longer than life expectancy in the United States. This is the greatest health catastrophe to hit the West since the terrible Spanish flu at the end of World War I. Now, can you imagine, if you look at the number of cases, for example, there have been 288,000 cases in China. In the United States, there have been over 98 million. But that would be equivalent to 425 million cases in China. Can you imagine this? This is what the Chinese zero COVID policy in the Chinese government has saved them. There are more than 4.6 million people who are alive in China today who would be dead if the policies which the United States advocates had been carried out in China. Incidentally, this is continuing. The talk that the pandemic is over is a straightforward lie. If you take the number, let's take the daily cases. Before we did this interview, I looked up the daily situation in the United States and the daily situation here in China. China had 2,365 daily cases. The United States had 46,000. But again, you've got to multiply by more than 4. That would be equivalent to 162,000 cases in China a day. It is simply untrue that the pandemic is over. Or take the number of deaths, which would be the case, right? Okay. In this situation in China has just been shocked by the fact that there are two deaths in China, just reported, right? But in the United States, you have 340 deaths a day. In terms of the population, that would be 1,130 deaths per day. So China is shocked by the fact there are 2 deaths, but there'll be 1,130 if it was having the number of deaths today that there were in China. It is simply a lie that the pandemic is over in the West. Now, in addition to cases, you've got to understand what is the cumulative effect of this. Not merely in deaths, but in what is called long COVID. I don't know how well that term is known in China, but what it means is people who suffer permanent or very long-term damage to their health as a result of the COVID. This means suffering for more than 3 months. Okay, right. Nearly 8% of the US population is suffering from long COVID. That's over 25 million people. In China, that will be 110 million people suffering from long-term COVID consequences. And these are extremely serious. If we take my own country, they make a more severe definition of long COVID. That means people whose daily functioning is equivalent, is limited a lot. That is the official definition. Okay. That's 409,000 people in Britain. But China's population is more than 20 times the people of Britain. That would be 8.6 million people in China who were unable to go about their normal daily activities for months, or in some cases for years. Okay. Let me just take cases which I know personally. One is because I happen to know his father, Martin Jakes, who's a well-known expert on China. His son, Ravi Jakes, has had long COVID. He's had long COVID for 2 years. Now, Ravi Jakes was a very talented person. He was at Stanford University. He'd won a scholarship to a top Chinese university. He's a very capable violinist, right? He considers a good day is where he can get out of bed for 2 hours. The rest of the time says he has to spend in bed, watching the television with his eyes closed. Look at the situation for older and vulnerable people. They are permanently at risk in the West. They cannot undertake a normal life. For example, go into a restaurant. You might say that they could take precautions such as masks, but you can't always wear a mask. You can't go to a restaurant and wear a mask. You've got to eat. This means every time these people, they either go to a restaurant at permanent risk to their health, or they have to abandon going to restaurants. They can't go to restaurants. It's impossible for them. Right, okay. When they travel, the situation, the problem for myself, for example, is because I'm at home, I'm very careful. I take precautions because one of the pieces of luck I had, it was only by luck that I was out of China, or by accident that I was out of China when COVID started. So obviously the institute where I work, as I knew that COVID would come to Britain, sent me the instructions which they were giving to their staff on how to protect themselves. Masks, sanitation, how to behave with people. So I was very well prepared. In fact, I was able to help my friends in this country, because at that time it was difficult to get masks in Britain. I ordered and I had sent from China masks for my friends. Some of them were a bit skeptical. They said, "Well, why are you getting a sent mask from China?" Because at that time, the British government was saying, don't wear masks. Well, they don't think that now. Now they think they're very grateful for that situation, for the situation that I was able to have. So I am in my home relatively protected. I'm not completely protected. My wife, really, quite honestly, because she wanted to go and see our daughter, she went to something and she got COVID. Very fortunately, because we took very big precautions and she was away for several days, she was testing all the time, and she came back and knew she had COVID. And I, at that time, didn't have COVID. So we separated each other for two weeks fortunately, in the same house. We could live separately in the 2 weeks, and I didn't manage to get COVID. But in 2 years, she went away, I think, 3 times, and one of them she got COVID. So there's this idea that the pandemic is over and that the pandemic is not dangerous is absolutely nonsense. And the talk that people are living ordinary lives is absolute nonsense. So, okay, as I say, come on this. In my home, I'm not completely safe because, you know, my wife, it's a very, very hard thing. Obviously, you know, not to see your children. She wanted to see our daughter. I mean, they're grown up, they don't live at home. Okay. But I'm relatively safe. But the travel is a big problem. Because the moment that I would have to go out onto the transport system, it's a risk. Traveling by air is a risk. So therefore, the question of travel, the idea that you're living a normal life is absolutely nonsense. Also, a big myth is that once you've had it, you're safe from it. This was the so-called nonsense idea of herd immunity, which was put forward. It was like, it's true, for example, if you take a disease like smallpox, once you've had smallpox and you survive smallpox, you're safe for the rest of your life. Well, smallpox doesn't exist but anymore, fortunately. Humanity's got rid of it. You know, there are serious diseases like that. But this is not true of COVID. There are many people who have had COVID many times. In some cases, people have been recorded having COVID 5 times. And the people who escaped the first time, the first or second time, they didn't have serious consequences. It was like, you know, a severe flu or something like that. But then the third time, they had long COVID. Their life was permanently damaged by this. So this talk that what's going on is normal is absolute and complete nonsense. Over 1,000 people will be dying a day in China. If you had now the position as in the United States, 4.6 million people would be dead. I don't think that the Chinese government has saved millions of people. The Chinese people should be just praising their government. Think of that, more than 4 million people, Chinese, who are alive, who would be dead if it hadn't been for the actions of the government. And I have never seen, really in my life, because in the West we've led protected lives in the sense that we have a good standard of living, we have a good health care. That's another thing, incidentally, in China. It's the protection and health care in the urban areas would be better if the healthcare got into Chinese villages, into the rural areas. If COVID got there, who knows what would be the situation? That would be very bad. I know that during the initial outbreak of COVID, Chinese villages cut themselves off. They wouldn't allow anybody in. Very sensible. But you have COVID now spread in the Chinese countryside, where you don't have the level of health facilities. You can't have a specialized hospital in every village which exists in China. This is the biggest attack on the population of the West in practical terms that has existed during my lifetime. Far more Americans have been killed by COVID. I mean, by which I mean about 30 times as many Americans have been killed by COVID as were killed in the Vietnam War. There hasn't been a fall in life expectancy in the United States of 2.7 years during, you know, for about 100 years. So this is a catastrophe. The picture which is being given to the people in China is a straightforward propaganda lie. And the reason that this lie is being given is because Western companies want to make profits. They have allowed millions of people in the West to be killed or to have their lives ruined because they want to make profit. You want to know how ruthless capitalism is? How lucky the Chinese people are to have socialism? Just see what's happened with the people in the West under COVID. Well, firstly, you yourself show that you underestimate even you underestimate how bad the situation in the West is, because you said the Chinese government has saved thousands of lives. That's a great underestimate. The Chinese government has saved millions of lives. More, to be precise, if it had the same deaths as the US, as I said, it would have suffered 4.6 million deaths. So even you, it shows how protected you are in China.
Yeah.
You support the government's policy, but even you, your first reaction is to understate how many lives people save. That's not a criticism of you. It's just to show the situation. It gives me an idea for how much people in the situation underestimate the situation in China, that people making propaganda. Okay. On the economy, it's not simply not true that the way to have good economic growth is to have the opening up policy, because we can look at the facts. Recently, the GDP figures for both the United States and China were published. So we can go back 3 years. We can take what's happened during the last 3 years, go back to the third quarter of 2019. That's just before the pandemic started. During that time, China's economy has grown by 14.3%. That's about 4.5% a year. That's slow by China's standards. But let's look at the comparison with the United States. The United States in that period has grown by 4.7%. That is about 1.5% a year. So therefore, China, although it's true its economy slowed, has been growing 3 times as fast as the United States, because the United States economy slowed down even more. So therefore, the situation is not the case that what has happened in the United States is that it has good economic growth and China has low economic growth. China's been growing at 3 times as fast as the United States. Incidentally, China's grown, the Eurozone has only grown by 2.8%. So China's been growing by 5 times as fast as the Eurozone. So it's not absolutely not true that what has been happened with the economic situation is that the saving the millions of Chinese lives has resulted in China's economy not performing as well as the United States. If you look at the situation, what has caused the problems in the United States, it wasn't the lockdowns. It's the fact that the US economy doesn't invest. In the US, the net fixed investment, that's when you take a depreciation, in the US has fallen from 11.3% of GDP 60 years ago. It's fallen to 3.8%. It's growing so slowly because it doesn't invest. And the situation in China, the risk in China is not huge losses from the lockdowns, because at any particular point in time, relatively small proportion of the population is affected in China by lockdowns. Most of the people live in their normal lives. The big problem in China would be if there was a big fall in investment in the economy or not enough stimulus in the economy. And that's that's the problem which has created the situation. So it's not the case that it's the lockdowns that have created the economic problem. Any lockdowns have created the economic situation in the West, and nor is it true that the West is now growing well. It's not. It's terrible. And the US growth is 1.5% a year, and it's projected by the IMF to fall next year. So the recession in the West, there was a little bit of a recovery in 2021 and a little bit of recovery this year. The West is now going into very slow growth at best. In large parts of it, for example, in Europe, it'll probably go into recession. That is, the output will fall. So that the idea, therefore, that the West is saving itself from economic problems by not having lockdowns is just absolutely factual nonsense. As I say, China's grown 3 times as fast as the United States. So this claim that China is suffering great because of the lockdowns and the West is going well because of it's not having lockdowns is simply untrue. It's just not supported by the facts. Well, there's 2 aspects to this. One is, to deal with it in absolute detail, you have to have medical knowledge. I'm not a medical person, so I can only look at the broad features of that, not all the detailed things. But some of the things are absolutely obvious from the statistics, and the economic side, of course, I can deal with in detail, right? Okay. The key feature about the situation is, firstly, China has already saved 4.6 million lives. So that's the first thing. The first great wave of COVID in the West, China was completely protected from. Now, pandemics themselves have a dynamic. For example, at the time of the so-called Spanish flu after World War I, in which tens of millions of people died, at that time they had none of the medical facilities which exist now, but nevertheless this eventually died out, because after all, the aim of a virus is not to kill people. The aim of the virus is to multiply. It's for living itself. It's not killing people. In fact, if it kills huge numbers of people very rapidly, it's not very good for the virus, because it can't spread, because the people it's infecting are dying. So therefore, there is some evidence that there is a tendency for pandemics to become weaker with time, for the virus to become weaker with time. That is certainly what happened with Spanish flu, because they had no effective means in the beginning of the 1920s to get rid of it. This may occur. Medical experts will have a bigger opinion on that. So it's very, very important, therefore, already that China has protected itself from the initial situation in which it's possible that the virus was more deadly. Secondly, of course, during this period of time, we've got the ability to bring in place better medical facilities. We have vaccinations, drugs are being introduced, even such questions, the nurses and doctors in the hospitals know better how to deal with COVID. So therefore, even if the COVID spreads, after periods of time, it may be less virulent, and the protection, that may be the case, but we certainly know that the protection will be getting better. So therefore, this is very important thing. And we can see this working at the present time. As I said, even if we take the daily situation today, China hasn't had any deaths for quite a long period of time. There happened to be 2 deaths which were reported today, whereas if you had the equivalent number of deaths in the United States in China, you would have had over 1,000 deaths. So this is already China's dealing with the situation very well. Speed of response is extremely important, because the virus grows exponentially. So therefore, the more quickly, that means it goes 2 cases, 4 cases, 8 cases, 16 cases, and very quickly you're into many thousands of cases. So therefore, the key question is the speed of lockdown. In our country, in which there was a study, the government, the first lockdown was introduced only about 10 days too late, is the estimate of the medical experts. And in that time, 95% of the cases developed during those 10 days. So therefore, the speed with which you act is extremely important. Therefore, these mobile testing and acting very rapidly is absolutely vital within this situation. As regards the economic situation in the West is going to get worse. We have the worst stagflation in the West. That is the combination of inflation and economic downturn for almost half a century. US inflation recently was 9.1%, which is the highest for 40 years. The United States claims that this is due to the war in Ukraine. This is straightforwardly a lie. All you have to do is look at the timeline and you'll see it's not true. US inflation went up from 0.1% in May 2020 to 7.5% in January 2020. That is before the Ukraine war started. The latest US figure for inflation is 7.7%, but it was 7.5% before the Ukraine war started. 95% of the inflation in the United States took place before the Ukraine war. So it's simply a lie that it's the Ukraine war which is responsible for the inflation. So you have a huge inflationary wave. I won't go into the economics of it in detail. I'm writing an article about it, on why there is such a bad inflationary situation in the US. But you also have the US economy is drastically slowing down. Its projected growth next year is about 1%, and the only discussion in the United States is whether the economy is going to slow down or whether the economy is going to go in recession. This is despite the fact there are no lockdowns at all in the United States now going on. So therefore, the economic downturn isn't due to the lockdowns, it's due to the economic policy in the United States. And the difference is that China carries out a supply side policies, as it's put. That is, ensures that not merely there is an increase in consumption, but there is an increase in investment. Therefore, in the United States, you have simply an increase in consumption, you have no increase in investment, and therefore you get very high inflation. In China, you have an increase in consumption, which is necessary because retail sales have fallen somewhat because of the effects of the COVID lockdowns. But you have not merely a consumer stimulus, you have a supply side stimulus. Therefore, we're absolutely certain China's economy is going to grow much more rapidly than the United States this year, and is going to grow much more rapidly than the United States next year. So the problem in the economic economic recovery in China is not fundamentally rooted in the COVID situation at all. It's not rooted in the lockdowns, because if it was the case that it was the lockdowns that were the big problem, then the United States economy would be growing very rapidly. Instead, the United States economy is slowing down. So it's economic policies of stimulus, economic policies of investment. It's not the lockdowns that is the big problem to economic growth. So therefore, China, firstly, is controlling the situation on the medical side with its very rapid responses and improvement, doubtless, in medical care. And secondly, it's got an economic policy that has allowed it to grow 3 times as fast as the United States. So not merely is the anti-COVID policy of China much more successful than that of the United States, the economic policy of China is much more successful than the United States. So the Chinese people should be firstly grateful to the Chinese government for the success in COVID. And secondly, it should be very grateful because the economic policy is being successful. Obviously, given the very, very negative world economic situation, this is the worst world economic situation for 40 years. Obviously, China's economy has slowed down a bit, but it's not slowed down primarily due to the COVID situation. It's the most important factor is the very negative situation which exists in the world economy, and China's economy is performing much better than the United States.